The courtroom was unlike anything 12-year-old Emily Carter had ever seen. It was a massive chamber of polished oak and cold marble, packed from wall to wall with strangers who seemed to breathe in unison. Rows of benches were filled with reporters, townsfolk, and curious onlookers who had come not just to hear testimony, but to witness a spectacle. The trial had gripped the small city for weeks, its scandalous headlines splashed across every newspaper and flashing on every television screen. Yet all the gossip and rumors had boiled down to this moment: Emily, the youngest and most fragile witness, stepping into the eye of the storm. The sound of her small shoes against the tile echoed unnaturally loud. She held her mother's hand as they walked toward the front, her knuckles white from squeezing too tightly. Her mother whispered words of encouragement, but Emily barely heard them. Her eyes were fixed on the elevated bench, where the judge sat like a king in his fortress. His robe was jet black, his gavel resting like a weapon beside him. His gaze was heavy and piercing, scanning the child with something between skepticism and concern. Emily's stepfather sat at the defense table, his tailored suit crisp, his face composed into a mask of indifference. To anyone else, he looked calm, dignified even. But Emily knew the truth. She knew that beneath the polished exterior was a man who could make threats so chilling they lingered like ghosts. He sat there with folded arms and the faintest smirk tugging at the corners of his lips, as though daring her to speak. The prosecutor, a determined woman in her 40s, with sharp eyes and a steady voice, gave Emily a small nod of encouragement. Emily swallowed hard. She was supposed to be the star witness, the one person who could shine light on the darkness her stepfather had hidden so well. But in that moment, staring out at the sea of strangers, she felt impossibly small. The judge tapped his gavel once, a sound cracking through the courtroom. Order. The witness may approach the stand. Emily let go of her mother's hand and climbed into the tall wooden chair. It seemed far too big for her, like a throne designed for someone twice her size. Her legs dangled inches above the floor. The bailiff handed her a small Bible and asked her to swear to tell the truth. She placed her trembling hand on it and whispered the words she had practiced over and over. "I promise to tell the truth." Murmurs spread across the audience, quickly silenced by another sharp rap of the gavel. The judge leaned forward slightly, his face unreadable. "You may begin," he said to the prosecutor. The air was heavy, as if the whole room was holding its breath. Emily glanced sideways and caught sight of a familiar shape resting calmly at her feet. Scout, her German shepherd. His presence was the only comfort in the suffocating chamber. His golden eyes lifted to hers, steady and unafraid, reminding her that she wasn't alone. The prosecutor's voice was gentle as she asked the first question. "Emily, can you tell the court who the man sitting over there is?" Emily's gaze shifted reluctantly toward her stepfather. He met her eyes with a look so cold it nearly froze her words. But then, under the table, she felt the soft press of Scout's fur against her calf. She took a deep breath. "That's my stepdad," she said softly, her voice trembling at the edges. The prosecutor nodded reassuringly. "And do you remember what happened the night of the incident?" Emily opened her mouth, but the words tangled in her throat. She remembered too well the shouting, the threats, the way he had gripped her mother's arm so tightly that her skin had turned purple. But saying it out loud, in front of him, in front of everyone, was like trying to push through a wall of fear. She hesitated, glancing toward the jury box where 12 strangers watched her with expectant eyes. Some looked sympathetic, others skeptical. A few leaned forward, as though she were a puzzle they were eager to solve. The silence grew so long that the judge cleared his throat impatiently. "Answer the question, young lady." Emily's lips parted, and a single word slipped out. "Yes." The prosecutor pressed on gently. "Can you tell us what you saw?" Emily's hands twisted nervously in her lap. The courtroom seemed to lean closer, waiting, hungering for her words. She felt the pressure crushing her chest. She wanted to disappear. And then she heard the faintest sound of breath beside her. Scout shifted slightly, resting his chin on the wooden rail of the witness stand. His calm presence anchored her, pulling her back from the brink of panic. Emily reached down and brushed her fingers over his head, drawing strength from his steady heartbeat. The prosecutor noticed and gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Take your time, Emily. You're safe here. Safe." The word echoed in Emily's mind. Was she really? Her stepfather's smirk deepened, as though he knew exactly what she was thinking. She remembered the threats whispered late at night. "If you say a word, your mother will pay. Do you understand?" The thought made her chest tighten again, but when she looked back at Scout, his unflinching eyes seemed to whisper a different promise. "You're not alone. Speak." And so, with a shaky breath, Emily began to tell her story. She described the shouting, the slammed doors, the way her stepfather's voice had filled the house like thunder. She described the fear that wrapped around her like chains, how she had hidden in the corner, clutching Scout, while her mother pleaded for mercy. Her voice wavered, but she did not stop. Each word felt like a stone lifted off her shoulders. The audience listened in rapt silence. Even the judge, who had started the session with doubt in his eyes, leaned forward now, his expression softened by the weight of her testimony. By the time she finished the first part of her account, the courtroom was utterly still. Scout rested quietly at her side, his job done for the moment. Emily exhaled shakily, relief and fear swirling inside her. She had spoken. She had broken the silence. But as the prosecutor prepared to ask the next question, Emily's stepfather shifted in his seat. His smirk hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had grown sharper, darker. Emily felt a shiver crawl down her spine. She had spoken the truth, but the hardest part was only just beginning. The moment Emily finished her first hesitant account, the judge called for a brief recess. His gavel cracked against the wood, and the murmurs of the crowd filled the chamber like a floodgate breaking open. Reporters rushed to scribble down their impressions. Attorneys whispered strategies to their assistants, and townsfolk exchanged knowing looks, as though they had witnessed something both extraordinary and fragile. Emily didn't move from the stand. Her small hands remained clenched on her lap, and her eyes stared at the polished floor as though she could fall through it at any moment. She felt lighter, yes, for having spoken, but also exposed, as if the words had stripped away every layer of protection she had left. It was then that Scout shifted closer to her. The German shepherd pressed his body against her leg, anchoring her in the middle of the storm. Emily bent down, burying her face briefly in the warm fur behind his ear. His steady breathing reminded her of late nights at home, when fear had curled inside her chest, and he had been the only one to stay by her side. Her mother rushed forward as the bailiff guided Emily away from the stand. "You did so well," she whispered, hugging her tightly. But Emily didn't answer. She was focused on Scout, whose unwavering eyes seemed to promise something her mother couldn't safety, no matter what. Across the room, the defense attorney was already on his feet, his voice sharp as he approached the judge. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. Allowing a dog to sit with the witness, especially a child, creates an emotional manipulation of the jury. It undermines the integrity of these proceedings." The judge leaned back in his chair, folding his hands across his stomach. His brow furrowed as he considered the objection. The air grew tense. The room seemed to hold its breath. The prosecutor countered calmly. "Your Honor, the presence of a service animal for a minor is entirely within legal precedent. Scout is not here to testify. He is here to provide emotional support to a child who has endured extraordinary trauma. To strip her of that would be to silence her voice. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. His gavel tapped gently against the wood, not in command, but in thought. Finally, he said, "The objection is noted, but overruled. The animal may remain provided it does not disrupt these proceedings. If the dog so much as makes a sound, it will be removed immediately." The defense attorney's jaw tightened, but he sat down, masking his irritation behind a practiced expression. Emily heard every word. Relief washed over her like a tide, but it was laced with a heavy responsibility. Scout was allowed to stay, but only if he behaved perfectly. She bent down and cupped his face in her small hands. "We have to be careful," she whispered. Scout licked her palm once, a quiet reassurance. When the court resumed, Emily returned to the stand, Scout padding loyally at her side. This time, though, the courtroom seemed different. The reporters didn't just scribble about the crime. They wrote about the girl and her dog, the unusual pair that had captured the room's attention. The jury's eyes softened slightly when they looked at her, though the defense attorney glared as though Scout himself were an enemy. The prosecutor continued with her questions, careful and slow, but Emily's nerves began to fray again. Every detail she recounted felt like ripping open an old wound. The defense attorney sat, waiting for his turn, his eyes sharp, already plotting how to unravel her with precision. Emily knew what was coming, and the thought made her stomach twist. But whenever her hands shook, she reached for Scout. She would brush her fingers over his back, feel the steady warmth of his body, and the panic in her chest would ease just enough for her to keep speaking. To the jury, it looked like an innocent child leaning on her companion. To Emily, it was survival. Whispers rose in the gallery. "Look at that dog. He's like her." "Shadow. She won't even speak, unless her hand's on him. I've never seen a service animal behave like that in court." The judge banged his gavel to silence the chatter, but he, too, could not help sneaking glances at the animal. Scout was not restless. He was not distracted. He sat perfectly still, his gaze flicking between Emily and the people who questioned her, as though he understood every word. The defense attorney finally rose for cross-examination, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. The warmth of the prosecutor's tone was gone, replaced by a blade of words designed to cut. "You're a clever girl, aren't you?" he began, pacing slowly before her. "You've had time to practice what to say. Did your mother help you with your story?" Emily's throat closed. She shook her head. "Are you sure?" His voice dripped with false kindness. "You didn't sit in your room rehearsing what to tell these good people? Maybe you've read too many stories? Watched too many shows?" Emily fidgeted, her gaze dropping, and whispers rippled through the gallery. Her stepfather leaned back in his chair, his smirk broadening. He could smell victory in her hesitation. Scout's ears twitched. Emily's hand slid onto his back, her fingers tangling in his fur. She whispered almost imperceptibly, though not the secret command, just a plea for strength. The attorney circled closer. "Do you even remember what happened? Or are you confusing dreams with reality?" Emily swallowed hard, her voice nearly cracking. I remember." "You remember?" He leaned in, towering above her. "Or you think you remember?" Scout lifted his head, his golden eyes narrowing. He didn't move beyond that, but his presence was enough to send a subtle shift through the room. The jury noticed. The spectators noticed. The attorney noticed, too. His lip curled slightly, as if offended by the silent defiance of the animal. "Your Honor," he said loudly, turning away from Emily, "this is exactly what I warned about. The jury is watching her lean on that dog for answers. This isn't testimony, it's theatrics." The judge banged his gavel once. "Mr. Harlow, the girl has every right to answer in her own way." You will continue your questioning without commentary. The attorney clenched his jaw and turned back to Emily, his voice colder now. Tell me, child, how can you be so sure of anything when you're just a frightened little girl? The question sliced through Emily's chest. She felt the sting of tears rise to her eyes. Her hands trembled violently. And then, under the table, Scout nudged her leg with his nose. She looked down, met his unblinking eyes, and felt the strength return. Emily straightened slightly, her voice fragile but steady. Because I was there, she said. A ripple of surprise passed through the room. The attorney hesitated for the first time, taken aback by the firmness in her tone. For the first time in the trial, it was not the defense attorney controlling the rhythm. It was the girl. And though no one yet understood it, Scout was quietly, patiently, preparing to play the role that would soon leave even the judge frozen in disbelief. The defense attorney, Mr. Harlow, adjusted his tie with a flourish and stepped closer to the witness stand. His eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto Emily like a hawk circling prey. He knew this was his chance to dismantle the prosecution's fragile case, to shatter the child's credibility before she gained momentum. Every movement he made, every question he prepared, was designed not to uncover truth, but to plant doubt. He clasped his hands behind his back, pacing slowly. Emily, he began smoothly, you've been through a lot, haven't you? You've had adults telling you what to do, what to say. Isn't that true? Emily hesitated, her lips parting but no words forming. She wanted to say no, but the weight of his stare froze her. Scout pressed gently against her leg, his warmth grounding her, but the fear of misspeaking tangled her thoughts. You see, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Harlow said, turning toward them, as though Emily had already admitted guilt. Children are impressionable. They want to please the adults around them. Sometimes they imagine things. Sometimes they exaggerate. Isn't that right, Emily? Emily shook her head weakly. No, I'm not imagining. Harlow pounced. Not imagining? Then tell me, what color tie was your stepfather wearing that night? What shoes did he have on? What time, exactly, did all of this happen? The questions came rapid fire, each sharper than the last. Emily stammered, unable to recall trivial details from a night she remembered more for terror than for ties and shoes. The jury shifted uncomfortably, their eyes narrowing as if her faltering proved something. Her stepfather leaned back in his chair, the smug grin spreading wider across his face. He knew this game well. He had counted on Harlow to twist Emily's fear into confusion, to make her story collapse under its own weight. Harlow leaned closer, lowering his voice but sharpening its edge. Emily, you said your stepfather threatened your mother. Did anyone else hear him? Any neighbors? Any friends? Or is this just what you want to believe? Emily's eyes filled with tears. She remembered the shouting, the bruises on her mother's arm, the promises whispered in the dark to stay silent or else. But with every question, Harlow carved away at her confidence, until the truth felt like it was slipping through her fingers. The crowd murmured restless. Some shook their heads sympathetically at the trembling child, while others leaned back with skepticism. One juror scribbled furiously in a notebook. Another exchanged a doubtful glance with the person beside her. Emily clutched the wooden edge of the stand. Her heart hammered so loudly she thought it might echo through the room. She wanted to scream, to shout that she wasn't lying, but the words caught in her throat, strangled by fear. Scout's ears perked up. He pressed his head firmly against her knee, sensing the storm within her. Emily's hand dropped instinctively to his head, her fingers tightening around his fur. The pressure of his body reminded her that she wasn't as alone as Harlow wanted her to feel. But Harlow wasn't finished. He straightened, his voice rising for the gallery to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, We have here a frightened child with a loyal pet. But fear is not fact. Loyalty is not law. What she feels does not make it true. The prosecutor shot to her feet. Objection, Your Honor. He is testifying instead of questioning the witness. Sustained, the judge barked, though his eyes flickered with unease. Harlow nodded curtly, then turned back to Emily, lowering his tone again. Emily, you don't want to lie, do you? You understand that lying under oath is a serious crime. Emily shook her head quickly, a tear rolling down her cheek. I'm not lying, she whispered. The attorney leaned in even closer, his voice almost hissing now. But how can we know that, Emily? How can we know that what you're saying isn't just a story you've convinced yourself is real? The words struck her like blows. The room blurred. The jury seemed miles away. Her stepfather's smirk grew into a shadow that stretched across her thoughts. She felt the walls closing in, her voice slipping further and further away. Scout shifted again, his tail brushing against her ankle. Emily bent down slightly, brushing her lips against his ear. It was almost instinct, a reflex born from the countless hours they had trained together. She whispered a phrase no one else in the world would understand, a secret command. Scout's body stiffened. His ears pointed forward, his golden eyes fixed on the defense attorney like lasers. A low, steady growl rumbled in his chest, deep enough to vibrate against the wooden floor. The sound wasn't loud, but in the silence of the courtroom, it might as well have been thunder. Harlow froze mid-step, his mouth hanging open. The jury's heads snapped toward the dog. The gallery gasped audibly. The judge slammed his gavel down. Order, order in this court. But Scout didn't lunge. He didn't bark. He simply sat upright, shoulders square, eyes locked on Harlow, as though he were peeling back the man's very skin to see what lay beneath. The growl continued, low and steady, the kind of sound that made the hair on the back of your neck rise. Emily straightened, her hand resting calmly on Scout's back. For the first time since the questioning began, she felt strong. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Whispers rushed through the crowd. Did you see that? The doggy reacted to him. Is that even allowed? Harlow tried to regain his composure, but his voice cracked as he pointed a finger toward Scout. This is a stunt. The girl is manipulating the jury with her animal. The judge's gavel thundered again. Control your outbursts, Mr. Harlow. And control that dog, Miss Carter, or it will be removed. Emily didn't flinch. She stroked Scout's head gently, and the growl ceased. But the damage was done. The image was seared into every mind in that courtroom. The fearless dog calling out the powerful man's lies without a word spoken. The judge adjusted his glasses, his face unsettled in a way Emily had never seen before. For the first time since the trial began, the authority in the room no longer belonged to him or to the defense attorney. It belonged to a girl and her dog. And though the trial was far from over, everyone in that courtroom sensed it. The balance of power had just shifted. The courtroom had reached a fever pitch. Emily's small frame looked even tinier against the towering witness stand, her hands gripping the edge as though holding on for dear life. Her face flushed as the defense attorney's voice grew sharper, more insistent and merciless. Emily, he snapped, pointing a finger toward her trembling hands, you've contradicted yourself 3 times already. Isn't it true that your stepfather was never even present during those nights you claimed he threatened you? The words hung in the air like an accusation carved in stone. Emily's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Her throat tightened, and her eyes darted toward the jury. Their faces were a blur of uncertainty, skepticism etched into furrowed brows. The defense attorney pressed on, sensing her hesitation. You're frightened, aren't you? He said, lowering his tone in a mockingly gentle way. Not because of him, he gestured toward the accused, her stepfather, who sat smugly at the defense table. "But because you know deep down, your story doesn't add up. Isn't that true?" Emily's breathing grew shallow. The courtroom was silent, except for the scratching of a reporter's pen against paper. The weight of the trial threatened to crush her. Her stepfather's smile widened, feeding on her fear. But beneath the wooden desk, hidden from the jury's and judge's view, Emily's trembling fingers brushed against the warm fur of Scout, her German shepherd. The dog sat alert at her side, his amber eyes scanning the room. He had been quiet throughout the trial, a calming presence no one thought much of beyond comfort for a nervous child. Emily's touch became deliberate. She pressed her palm gently against his paw, tracing a subtle circle with her thumb. Scout's ears twitched. The girl leaned down ever so slightly, her lips barely moving, and whispered one word, so softly it vanished beneath the hum of the air conditioning. Truth. The command was one she and Scout had trained together for years, a secret no one in the courtroom could possibly know. Scout stiffened instantly, his muscles taut beneath his glossy coat. The German shepherd lifted his head high, eyes locking on the defense attorney. Then, as though on cue, a deep, guttural growl rumbled from his chest. It wasn't wild or unhinged. It was steady, purposeful, the kind of growl that makes every hair on the back of your neck stand upright. The defense attorney froze mid-sentence. His papers slipped slightly from his hand as he stumbled a step back, eyes darting toward the dog in disbelief. The jury gasped collectively. Someone in the back row let out a startled yelp. Reporters' pens scratched furiously. The bailiff instinctively took a step forward, unsure whether to intervene. "Order!" The judge thundered, slamming his gavel against the bench. Order in the court. But for those tense seconds, no one moved. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the 12-year-old girl and the dog at her side. Emily didn't flinch. Her small hand remained on Scout's back, steady and calm, as if she had expected this very moment. The defense attorney tried to recover, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. The animal is disrupting the proceedings. It's unsafe to allow this display to continue." But his voice wavered. The growl had rattled him more than he cared to admit. The judge's brows knitted, his gavel still poised in his hand. "Miss Carter," he said, voice softer now, almost cautious. "What is the meaning of this? Why did your dog react?" Emily swallowed hard, lifting her chin. For the first time since she took the stand, her voice rang with clarity. "Scout doesn't react like that to just anyone," she said. "He was trained to sense lies. He only growls when someone is being dishonest." A stunned murmur swept through the courtroom. Reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances, scribbling furiously. "That's absurd." The defense attorney barked, his face flushed crimson. A child's pet cannot be used as some sort of lie detector. But even as he spoke, Scout's unblinking gaze stayed locked on him, growl deepening for a moment before subsiding into silence. Emily's lawyer rose from the prosecution table. "Your Honor, the defense may call it absurd, but what we just witnessed is undeniable." Scout has remained silent and calm through hours of testimony, until the defense attempted to twist this child's words. The jury saw it with their own eyes. The judge looked torn, his gavel lowering slowly. For decades, he had presided over countless cases, but never in his career had something like this unfolded in his courtroom. He glanced at the jurors, noting how their eyes were no longer skeptical, but transfixed. Some leaned forward, whispering behind their hands. The defense attorney, desperate, jabbed a finger at Emily. "This is manipulation. The girl rehearsed this. She's—" Before he could finish, Scout let out another sharp growl, louder this time, echoing against the wooden panels of the chamber. The attorney snapped his mouth shut, color draining from his face. The judge banged the gavel again, though his hand trembled slightly. "That's enough," he declared. His voice, though firm, carried an undertone of unease. He turned back to Emily. "Young lady, is it true? Your dog was trained for this?" Emily nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. My uncle trained him." Scout can sense when someone's nervous, when their voice or body changes because they're lying. He doesn't growl at truth, only at lies. The courtroom was deathly silent again. The judge leaned back in his chair, his face pale, his fingers steepled in thought. He wasn't the only one frozen. The defense attorney stood rigid, sweat dotting his brow, while the accused shifted uncomfortably in his seat for the first time since the trial began. Emily kept her gaze steady. "I gave him the command to listen for lies," she explained, her voice unwavering now, "because I knew he'd show everyone the truth if I couldn't." The power in her words was undeniable. The child who had entered the courtroom trembling now radiated quiet strength, her loyal companion standing guard at her side. The judge, still visibly shaken, finally lowered his gavel onto the block with a sharp crack. "This court will recess for 15 minutes, he announced, his voice tight. "Bailiff, maintain order." Everyone remained seated until instructed. As the jurors whispered in stunned voices and reporters dashed for the hallway phones, the image burned into their minds was not of the defense attorney's bluster, nor of the accused's smug smile. It was of a girl and her dog, united in a moment of truth, so raw it left the judge himself frozen. Emily leaned down, pressing her forehead against Scout's. "Good boy," she whispered. Scout's tail thumped once against the floor. For the first time since the trial began, Emily smiled, not with fear, but with courage. And across the room, the defense attorney sat back in his chair, shaken to the core, realizing the trial had just shifted in a way he never anticipated. The 15-minute recess stretched like an eternity. Spectators shuffled restlessly in their seats, whispering in urgent tones about what they had just witnessed. The jury, instructed not to discuss the case, sat stiffly, their eyes betraying the weight of what had just transpired. Even the usually unflappable court reporters seemed rattled, their pens poised above paper, waiting for what would come next. Emily sat quietly in the witness chair, her small hand resting protectively on Scout's back. The German shepherd remained steady, breathing calmly, his amber eyes sweeping the room as though guarding his young handler. Emily's shoulders no longer hunched inward. For the first time, she looked like she belonged in that courtroom. When the recess ended, the judge returned, his expression grave. He had spent those minutes pacing in his chambers, wrestling with the implications. Was a dog's reaction admissible as proof? Could it sway the jury too much? Or was it simply one of those unexplainable moments in which truth showed itself, unbound by legal precedent? The gavel struck. "Court is back in session," the judge announced, his voice carrying the weight of unease. "Proceed." The prosecution attorney rose with deliberate calm. "Your Honor," she said, "before we continue questioning the witness, I feel compelled to address what happened moments ago. While we understand that Scout is not a conventional piece of evidence, the reaction witnessed by the jury was genuine, unprompted, and tied directly to the defense counsel's line of questioning. We contend that it strengthens the credibility of the witness rather than diminishes it." The defense attorney, still visibly shaken, bolted upright. "Strengthens it? Your Honor, this is ridiculous. You cannot allow a child and her mutt to turn this courtroom into a circus. What we witnessed was nothing more than a trained stunt, a ploy to manipulate these proceedings." Scout's ears flicked back at the raised voice, but Emily whispered something under her breath, and the shepherd remained calm. The jury noticed. "Enough," the judge said sharply, silencing the attorney. He turned his gaze toward Emily, his tone softening again. "Miss Carter, you claim your dog was trained to detect lies. Can you explain to this court how that came to be? Emily nodded, her eyes flicking briefly toward Scout before meeting the judge's gaze. My uncle is a trainer. He works with service dogs for veterans. When he realized how much I'd been through, after my stepfather threatened me and hurt my mom, he taught Scout special commands. One of them is to alert when someone lies. Her voice was steady, but her words struck like hammer blows. Several jurors leaned forward. Even the gallery quieted, straining to catch every syllable. How does he know when someone is lying? The judge asked carefully. Emily's lips pressed together before she answered. Dogs notice things people don't. Breathing changes, heartbeats, smells. My uncle says, Scout can tell when someone's scared because they're hiding something. He trained him to growl only when he's sure. Scout doesn't growl at truth. Only lies. The defense attorney scoffed. This is absurd, Your Honor. Dogs are not scientific instruments. This so-called truth dog has no place in a court of law. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. Perhaps not as evidence, but the jury has already seen the contrast. Scout has remained silent through every question until the defense attempted to twist this child's testimony. That speaks louder than words. The judge sat back, his face pale but unreadable. He looked at the jury, at Emily, and finally at Scout, who sat regal and composed, not a hair out of place. The dog's reaction is not formal evidence, he said at last, but the court acknowledges the context. The jury may weigh what they witnessed at their discretion. We will proceed. A ripple of murmurs coursed through the courtroom. Emily's lawyer approached the stand once more. Emily, she said gently, do you feel strong enough to continue? Emily nodded, her fingers curling into Scout's fur. Yes. Tell us again, in your own words, what happened the night your stepfather threatened you. Emily inhaled slowly. This time, she didn't falter. She spoke clearly, painting the scene. Her stepfather's voice low and menacing. The threats he whispered about what would happen to her and her mother if she ever told the truth. The fear that clung to her in the dark corners of their house. As her voice wove the story, Scout remained calm, his steady presence like a silent anchor. The defense attorney, though red-faced, interrupted. Objection. The child is simply repeating rehearsed lines. Before the judge could respond, Scout's ears twitched and a low growl escaped his throat directed squarely at the defense attorney. Gasps erupted again. The jury exchanged knowing glances. The judge's gavel cracked down. Silence in the court. But even his booming voice could not erase what had just been witnessed. Every time the defense interjected with a falsehood or accusation, Scout reacted with uncanny precision. Emily continued, her voice stronger with every sentence. He told me if I ever spoke up, he'd make sure no one believed me. He said I'd look like a liar. But I'm not lying. Scout knows it. And so do I. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The accused, her stepfather, shifted in his chair, his smug expression finally crumbling. A bead of sweat slid down his temple. For the first time, he looked nervous. The prosecutor seized the moment. Emily, has Scout ever been wrong before? Emily shook her head firmly. Never. Not once. The jury watched Scout, who sat quiet now, his gaze steady, no growl rumbling in his chest. Their skepticism dissolved with every second. The defense attorney floundered, his arguments unraveling. Why, you can't let this parlor trick decide the outcome of a serious trial. The prosecutor countered sharply. The outcome will be decided by truth, counselor. Something your client, and it seems, even you have trouble with. The defense attorney opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. Scout's ears perked. A warning growl built low in his throat. The attorney snapped his jaw shut, his face pale. The jury chuckled softly, quickly silenced by the bailiff's stern glance. The judge rubbed his temples. He had seen theatrics in his courtroom before, but this was no act. He was watching truth manifest in its strangest, most undeniable form. Finally, he leaned forward. "The testimony will stand," he declared. "The witness has shown remarkable clarity, and her credibility has been supported in ways none of us expected. The jury will consider this as they see fit." We moved forward. As the gavel struck, Emily exhaled deeply, relief washing over her. She leaned down and whispered, "Thank you, Scout." The shepherd's tail brushed against the floor, a quiet signal of loyalty. The balance of the trial had shifted. What once seemed like a hopeless battle for a frightened girl now turned into a fight anchored by courage and a bond between child and dog that no courtroom law could ever dismiss. The courtroom no longer felt like the same place it had been that morning. The air was thicker now, charged with a quiet electricity, every juror perched on the edge of their seat. Emily Carter, once the trembling child struggling to speak, now sat taller in the witness chair, her hand never leaving the back of Scout, her loyal German shepherd. For weeks, the prosecution had worried whether Emily could withstand the pressure of cross-examination. They had feared the defense would tear her apart, paint her as confused or coached. Yet here she was, her voice steady, her eyes unflinching, and beside her, a dog who seemed capable of cutting through lies more effectively than any attorney's objection. The judge adjusted his glasses, staring down at the girl as though he were seeing her for the first time. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone measured, "you may continue your testimony. But remember, the responsibility for truth lies with you, not with your animal. Do you understand?" Emily nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." Her lawyer approached the stand again. "Emily," she began softly, "can you explain to the jury what your stepfather told you when he thought no one else could hear?" Emily inhaled, the courtroom utterly silent. "He said if I told anyone about the money he was hiding, he'd make sure me and Mom paid for it. He said people like him don't go to jail because they can always find a way out. And if I tried to talk, he'd call me a liar until everyone believed him instead of me." Scout stirred slightly at her words, shifting closer to her legs, as though shielding her from the memory. The defense attorney leapt to his feet. "Objection. Hearsay. Intimidation tactics. This is nothing but dramatics, Your Honor." But before the judge could respond, Scout lifted his head, ears twitching, eyes narrowing on the defense attorney. The German shepherd gave a short, sharp growl, deep enough to rattle the wood panels. The jury gasped. The judge froze, his gavel suspended midair. And then, very slowly, he lowered it back onto his bench. "Objection overruled," he said, his voice low. The defense attorney's jaw tightened. He sank into his seat, color draining from his face. The jury's eyes lingered on him, some with suspicion, others with quiet amusement at his sudden retreat. Emily pressed forward. "Scout only growls when someone lies," she explained, her young voice clear. "He hasn't made a sound when I've told the truth." Not once. The prosecutor seized the momentum. "Emily, can you tell the jury why you finally decided to come forward?" The girl looked down at Scout, running her fingers gently through his fur before answering. "Because of him. Because Scout doesn't let me hide from the truth. He makes me brave enough to say what I know, even when it's scary." The courtroom held its breath. Even the judge's stern features softened, just slightly, as though struck by the honesty in her words. Meanwhile, the defendant, her stepfather, shifted uneasily at the defense table. His once confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a tight, drawn expression. He avoided the eyes of the jury, staring instead at the floor. The prosecutor turned sharply, her voice strong. "Emily, did your stepfather ever admit what he was doing?" Emily's gaze hardened. "Yes. He told me he was stealing money, and he used fake accounts so no one could catch him." He laughed about it. He said even if someone found out, he could buy his way out of trouble. And when I asked what would happen to me if I told, he said I'd regret it for the rest of my life. Gasps rippled through the room. Scout stayed perfectly silent. The defense attorney scrambled to his feet again. Lies. These are lies. The child is. Scout erupted with a fierce growl, louder than before. His hackles rose, not in wild aggression, but in precise, controlled warning. The sound echoed like a drumbeat of truth through the courtroom. The defense attorney's voice cracked. He snapped his mouth shut and stumbled backward, his papers scattering across the floor. The jury stared at him with open distrust. The judge banged his gavel. Order! I demand order! But his own face betrayed unease. He looked from the lawyer to the dog, then finally to Emily, as if silently acknowledging that something beyond the ordinary was unfolding before them all. Emily sat straighter, her courage solidified by Scout's unwavering presence. He's lying, she said firmly, pointing toward the attorney. Scout knows it. And so do I. The prosecutor leaned in. Emily, thank you. That will be all. She turned to the jury, her voice resonant. You have seen with your own eyes and ears how this child speaks nothing but truth, while the defense cowers under the weight of lies. Scout may not be evidence in the legal sense, but he is living proof of what honesty sounds like, and what deceit looks like when it's exposed. The jury nodded, many of them visibly moved. One older juror wiped at her eyes discreetly. Another, a younger man in a suit, leaned back with arms crossed, glaring at the defense table with open disdain. The judge sighed heavily, rubbing his temples as though the strain of what was happening pressed on his very bones. The court will adjourn for the day, he said at last, his voice weary. We reconvene tomorrow morning. Jurors, you are reminded not to discuss these proceedings outside this courtroom. The gavel struck. The courtroom exploded into chatter. Reporters rushed toward the doors, eager to file stories about the girl, the dog, and the lawyer who couldn't speak without being growled at. The bailiff struggled to maintain order as the crowd surged. Emily leaned down, wrapping her arms tightly around Scout's neck. We did it, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes, not of fear, but of relief. Scout licked her cheek, his tail thumping softly against the floor. Across the room, her stepfather glared at her, his face twisted with fury. But there was fear there too, a shadow creeping into his once confident posture. For the first time, he looked like a man who knew the walls were closing in. And at the bench, the judge sat frozen in thought, staring at the girl and her dog, as though they had cracked open a truth deeper than any statute could contain. He knew tomorrow's session would decide the outcome, but tonight, every soul who left that courtroom carried with them the unforgettable image of a child who turned the tide of justice with nothing but courage and the steady growl of her guardian. The tide had turned, and everyone knew it. The morning sun spilled through the courthouse windows, casting long streaks of light across the wooden benches. By the time court reconvened, the gallery was overflowing. Word of the previous day's events had spread like wildfire. A young girl, her loyal German shepherd, and a defense attorney left speechless under the growl of truth. Reporters had camped outside all night, hungry for another headline. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. The jury filed in, their faces tight with the weight of what they'd witnessed. Emily sat quietly at the witness stand again, Scout at her side, calm as ever. The dog's steady breathing was the only sound she focused on, grounding her in a sea of noise and doubt. The judge entered, robes swaying as he took his place. His face was a mask of composure, but his eyes betrayed fatigue. He had spent a sleepless night wrestling with questions no law book could answer. Could he allow a dog's behavior to sway the fate of a man accused of crimes? Could truth be measured in growls and silences? When the gavel struck, the room fell into silence. Court is now in session. The defense attorney stood almost immediately, his voice clipped and defensive. Your Honor, before we proceed, I must once again protest the allowance of this animal in these proceedings. The jury has been unfairly influenced by theatrics. Scout's head turned toward him, ears twitching. A low growl vibrated in his chest, not loud, but unmistakable. The attorney froze mid-sentence, his throat tightening. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The judge's gavel cracked down. That will be enough, counselor. You will restrain yourself, and the dog will remain. His tone was sharp, yet uncertain. Deep down, he knew the balance of the trial was no longer his to control. The prosecutor rose calmly. Your Honor, the defense fears the dog because the truth fears the light. Yesterday, the jury saw what happens when deception is spoken. Today, they will see the truth stand unshaken. She turned toward Emily. Miss Carter, I have only a few more questions for you. Emily nodded, her hand pressing into Scout's fur. Emily, why do you believe your stepfather thought he could get away with this? The girl's voice was steady. Because he always did. He lied to people, and they believed him. He scared me and Mom so much we didn't think anyone would help us. He thought no one would ever listen to me because I'm just a kid. Her stepfather shifted in his chair, scowling. The prosecutor continued, but they are listening now, aren't they? Emily looked at the jury, her chin lifting. Yes, they are. The jurors held her gaze, some nodding ever so slightly. The defense attorney scrambled to regain footing. He approached the stand, his voice dripping with forced calm. Emily, you love your dog very much, don't you? Yes, she answered. And you would do anything to protect him, wouldn't you? Yes. Then isn't it possible, the attorney pressed, his voice rising, that you've trained him to growl when you want him to? That you've manipulated this entire courtroom? Emily opened her mouth to respond, but Scout beat her to it. His growl erupted with such force it echoed off the walls. The attorney stumbled back, his face pale. The gallery gasped. The judge slammed his gavel again. Order. But even he looked shaken. Emily's voice rang out clear and firm. I didn't train him to lie. I trained him to protect the truth. The courtroom fell into silence, her words slicing through the air like a blade. The defense attorney stood frozen, his lips pressed tight, terrified to speak again. The judge leaned back heavily in his chair, rubbing his temples. His mind raced. He had presided over hundreds of trials: fraud, murder, robbery, betrayal, but never had he felt the foundations of justice bend beneath something so intangible. The law demanded facts, evidence, testimony. And yet, in front of him sat a child and her dog, unraveling lies with nothing more than instinct and courage. He glanced at the jury. Their eyes weren't on him. They weren't even on the lawyers. They were locked on Emily and Scout. He realized then that the trial had shifted beyond his control. It wasn't about legal precedent anymore. It was about credibility and truth. Still, he had a duty. The jury is reminded, he said carefully, that the dog's behavior is not to be considered evidence. You are to weigh the testimony of the witness, not the reactions of her companion animal. But even as the words left his lips, he knew they rang hollow. The jurors had already seen too much. The prosecutor gave a small nod, satisfied. No further questions. Emily stepped down from the witness stand. The bailiff escorted her past the jury box, Scout trotting faithfully at her side. Jurors followed her every movement, their expressions softened by admiration and respect. When she reached her mother, Emily collapsed into her arms. Scout curled at her feet, watchful as always. For the first time in months, she felt safe. The defense tried to recover by calling financial experts, character witnesses, even old friends of the defendant. But the damage was irreversible. Each time someone testified in the defendant's favor, their words felt thin, insubstantial. The jurors listened politely, but with skepticism. And whenever the defense attorney rose to speak, Scout's gaze tracked him like a predator studying prey. The attorney avoided looking at the dog altogether, his hands trembling as he shuffled his papers. The jury noticed. Everyone noticed. By late afternoon, the judge called for recess once again. As the gavel struck, reporters bolted from the gallery, shouting into their phones about the Truth Dog trial. The defense attorney slumped into his chair, sweat dripping from his brow. The prosecutor stood tall, her lips pressed in a quiet smile. The judge lingered on the bench after everyone filed out. Alone in the empty courtroom, he let out a long sigh, his hand resting on the gavel. For the first time in his career, he questioned whether the law was prepared for what it had just witnessed. He was a man of rules, of order, of precedent. Yet here was a case where the truth had been carried, not by statutes or statutes of limitations, but by the bond between a girl and her dog. He whispered to himself, "How am I supposed to instruct the jury on this?" His voice echoed through the hollow chamber. The answer didn't come. Only the memory of Scout's steady growl lingered, rattling the judge's thoughts. He knew tomorrow would bring closing arguments, and then the jury's decision. But tonight, as he stepped down from the bench and glanced once more at the empty witness stand where Emily and Scout had sat, he admitted to himself what he could never say aloud. The growl of that dog had shaken him deeper than any testimony he had ever heard. And that left him with a dilemma that no law book could resolve. The final day of trial dawned gray and heavy with mist, as though the weather itself understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. The courthouse steps were swarmed with reporters and camera crews, their breath visible in the morning air as they jostled for space. Headlines from across the country blared about the Truth Dog, and talk shows speculated endlessly about what would happen. Inside, the air was tighter than ever. Every bench in the gallery was filled. The jury sat with rigid backs, and even the bailiff seemed more tense than usual. Emily sat close to her mother in the front row, Scout curled at her feet. The dog's calmness seeped into her trembling fingers as she stroked his fur. When the judge entered, the room rose. His expression was grave, as though he carried the weight of not just this case, but the eyes of the nation. He adjusted his robes and gave a sharp nod before the gavel fell. Court is now in session. Closing arguments. The prosecutor stood first. She walked to the center of the courtroom with slow, deliberate steps, her voice steady but filled with quiet fire. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard the testimony. You've seen the evidence. And you've also seen what happens when lies try to masquerade as truth. A child sat before you, brave enough to speak of horrors no child should endure. And though the defense tried to silence her, intimidate her, dismiss her, she stood firm. With her dog at her side, she reminded us all that courage doesn't roar, it whispers. And sometimes it growls. A ripple of recognition passed through the jury box. The prosecutor went on. The defense will tell you this trial has been tainted by theatrics. But I ask you, was it theatrics when Emily trembled on that stand, recounting her stepfather's violence? Was it theatrics when a loyal animal reacted to lies no human ear could detect? Or was it truth, raw and unpolished, refusing to be buried any longer? She paused, then lowered her voice. This case is not about a dog. It is about a man who thought he could crush the spirit of a child and walk away unpunished. Do not let him. Give Emily justice. Show her that her voice matters. When she sat down, the courtroom was hushed, as though even breathing might break the spell. Then the defense attorney rose. His face was drawn, his confidence shattered. Still, he tried to muster authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I remind you that this is a court of law, not a circus. Dogs cannot testify. Animals cannot discern guilt. You must base your decision on evidence, not the antics of a child and her pet. If we allow this, we reduce justice to instinct, not fact." He cleared his throat, shifting his weight. "My client deserves a fair trial, free of prejudice stirred by fear of a growl. If you convict him based on anything but proven evidence, you undermine the very system you claim to defend." But his words hung lifeless in the air. His voice lacked conviction. His arguments sounded brittle. The jurors' faces remained stone, but their eyes drifted once more to Emily and Scout. The defense attorney faltered, then lowered his head, defeated. The judge gave the jury their instructions, his tone crisp but weary. "You must weigh the testimony, the evidence, and only what has been presented here. The dog's behavior is not evidence. You must not allow sympathy to guide you. You must rely on the facts." Yet as he spoke, his own words rang hollow. He could feel it in his bones. The jury had already been moved by something beyond statutes and guidelines. The jury retired. The courtroom emptied, but outside the courthouse, the crowd swelled chanting Emily's name, waving signs with Scout's likeness. "Truth has teeth," one banner read. Reporters swarmed every corner, cameras waiting for the verdict that would soon define this case. Inside the jury room, the deliberations began. At first, the jurors spoke carefully, weighing testimony, reviewing evidence. But quickly, the conversation circled back to the witness who had moved them most, not the experts, not the lawyers, but Emily herself. Her courage, her clarity, and the unshakable loyalty of her dog had cut through the fog of legal jargon. One juror finally said what everyone else was thinking. "We all saw it. The truth doesn't shake. Lies do." It took less than 3 hours. When the jury filed back into the courtroom, the air was electric. Emily's hands shook as her mother held her close. Scout pressed against her legs, steady and solid. The judge's gavel struck. "Will the foreperson rise?" A middle-aged woman stood, paper trembling in her hands. "We, the jury, find the defendant." She paused, the silence unbearable. "Guilty on all counts." The room erupted. Gasps, sobs, cheers sound crashed like a wave. Emily clutched her mother, tears streaming down her face. Scout barked once, sharp and triumphant, his tail wagging furiously. The defendant's face crumpled in fury, but the bailiffs were already at his side, handcuffs clicking. The defense attorney slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the floor. The judge hammered his gavel again and again, shouting for order, but even he couldn't suppress the swell of relief and joy. He finally gave up, leaning back as the noise thundered. His lips pressed into a thin line, not of anger, but of awe. He had never seen justice take this form, messy, emotional, unorthodox, but undeniably true. When order was restored, he spoke. "The court thanks the jury for their service. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date." His voice softened as he glanced at Emily. "And to the witness, your courage will not be forgotten." Emily met his gaze, her eyes wide but steady. For the first time in months, she felt safe. Not just because her stepfather was gone, but because she had been heard. As the courtroom emptied, reporters surged forward, their questions like hail. "Emily, how did you train your dog?" "Scout, the hero, how did he know?" "Judge, do you think this sets a new precedent?" The judge refused to answer, slipping quietly into his chambers. Alone, he sat heavily at his desk, head in his hands. He was not a man prone to sentiment, but today had shaken him. He had seen the limits of law, the way truth sometimes slipped between the cracks of rules and procedures. And he had seen a child, backed by a loyal animal, bridged that gap with nothing but honesty and courage. For a long time, he sat in silence. Then, almost against his will, a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He whispered to himself, "Justice wears many faces." Today, it had fur and 4 paws. Outside, the crowd chanted Emily's name. Scout barked along, the sound carrying like a victory bell. Cameras flashed, children waved, and strangers knelt to pet the dog that had become a symbol of truth. Emily hugged Scout tightly, burying her face in his neck. "We did it," she whispered. He licked her cheek, tail thumping, as if to say he'd known all along. And in that moment, beneath the gray skies, amidst the roar of the crowd, Emily no longer felt like the frightened girl who once thought no one would believe her. She was the girl who had stood, spoken, and been heard. The trial would fade into history books, debated in classrooms, studied in legal journals. But for Emily, it was simpler. Justice wasn't an abstract concept. Justice was her dog, her voice, her truth finally free.